Hi. Have you ever discovered that your entire reality was built on a lie? Not just a white lie or a small secret, but something so massive that it rewired your entire childhood in one instant. That was my life the day I found an old letter. A letter that proved the one person I thought was gone forever, my mother, had been alive all along. And the man I trusted most, my father, had been the one keeping that truth from me. Before I dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this story. Trust me, it only gets darker and more twisted from here. My name is Alex. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I believed I grew up in a single-parent household because my mother had died in a car accident when I was just 3 years old. That's what my father told me, anyway. He painted a vivid picture of that night whenever I asked about her. How it was raining, how another driver crossed the lane, how there was nothing anyone could do. He said she was gone instantly, and that he was left to raise me alone. I was too young to question it, and as I grew older, I accepted it as truth. But here's the thing. When you live with only one parent, especially one who is controlling by nature, you don't realize how skewed your perspective becomes. My father wasn't just strict. He was the type who wanted to dictate every aspect of my life. He chose my clothes until I was old enough to push back. He monitored my friends. He controlled which sports I played, even the shows I could watch on TV. And every time I asked about my mom, he shut it down. She's gone, son. Don't dig into the past. Focus on the future. Those words became a script I internalized, even though, deep down, I always felt something was missing. Fast forward to a few months ago. I was cleaning out the attic of the old house I grew up in. My dad had recently retired and decided to downsize, so he asked me to help go through boxes of junk. It was the usual clutter: old tax documents, broken tools, my childhood toys still caked in dust. But buried in an old cedar trunk was an envelope that caught my eye. It was yellowed with age, sealed, and my name was written across the front in delicate handwriting I didn't recognize. That I probably should have handed it to my dad right then and there. But something in my gut told me not to. I slipped it into my pocket and waited until I was back in my own apartment to open it. And when I did, the world I thought I knew collapsed in on itself. The letter was from my mother, dated years after she was supposed to have died. She wrote about how much she missed me, how she had been trying to reach me but was being kept away. She said my father had lied to her, told her I didn't want to see her, told her I was better off without her. She explained how she moved states away, how she kept sending letters that were always returned, and how she feared my father's threats if she pushed harder. My hands were shaking as I read those words. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Every memory I had of my childhood suddenly cracked open. The bedtime stories my dad told me, the way he snapped whenever I brought up my mom, the absence at school events when kids would bring their mothers. He didn't just fail to mention her, he actively erased her. And I had been living in that false reality for 3 decades. That I remember sitting on my couch, staring at that letter for hours. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was fake. Maybe someone was messing with me. But as I traced the handwriting, as I looked at the little details only a real mother would know, my stuffed bear's name, the way I hated broccoli as a kid, I knew it was genuine. And that realization was both electrifying and devastating. In that moment, one thought consumed me. If she's alive, where is she now? And just like that, my life split into 2 halves. The life I had lived under my father's version of the truth, and the life I was about to uncover for myself. That I barely slept that night. The letter sat on my coffee table like a ticking bomb, its folded edges worn from the countless times I'd opened and closed it. Every time I reread the words, it felt like my chest tightened a little more. The idea that my mother was out there somewhere, that she had been all along, was both electrifying and terrifying. That I tried to tell myself to wait, to think logically before doing anything rash. But patience had never been one of my virtues. By sunrise, I was already hunched over my laptop, pulling up every public records search I could access. Marriage licenses, property deeds, voter registrations. If my mother was alive, she had to be somewhere in the system. At first, nothing matched. Too many women with the same first name, too many dead ends. But then I thought of the handwriting. My father's neat block letters had always filled out my school forms, but this script, looped, flowing, felt familiar in a way I couldn't shake. I dug through my childhood keepsakes, a box of birthday cards and old report cards I had shoved in a closet. And there it was, One birthday card from when I was 4, signed in the same handwriting. Love, Mom. My stomach twisted. Why had I kept that card when I barely remembered the woman behind it? Had I subconsciously known it was important? And if that card existed, then my father had lied for even longer than I thought. I scanned the address printed on the card. The city was only 2 hours away. What were the chances she was still there? Of course, I couldn't just show up out of nowhere. If the letter was real, if she had been blocked from me all these years, there had to be reasons. Maybe legal reasons. Maybe dangerous ones. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing urgency in my chest that I typed her name into a more advanced database, a paid search service. My hands shook as I entered my credit card information. 10 seconds later, there it was. Her name, attached to a current mailing address. Not a graveyard, not a death certificate. An actual, real address. That I sat back in my chair, stunned. She was alive. That fact alone should have brought me relief, but instead it felt like my world tilted further. Because now the question shifted from is she alive to why didn't she ever come for me? I thought about calling my dad, demanding an explanation. But the image of his face when I'd asked about her as a kid stopped me cold. The quick flare of anger, the way he shut me down, the finality in his voice. He wouldn't tell me the truth. Not then, not now. Instead, I decided on something else. I'd drive to that address. I needed to see her with my own eyes. The following Saturday, I got into my car before dawn. My heart hammered the whole drive, my thoughts racing faster than the passing highway signs. What if she slammed the door in my face? What if she didn't recognize me? Or worse, what if she had a whole new family, kids she raised while abandoning me? When I finally pulled onto the quiet street listed on the search result, my palms were slick with sweat. The house was modest, with peeling blue paint and a small garden out front. A wind chime tinkled in the breeze. Normal, ordinary. And yet, to me, it was the most terrifying place on earth. I parked across the street and sat there for 10 minutes, paralyzed. Then the front door opened. A woman stepped out, holding a watering can. Her hair was streaked with gray, her shoulders slightly hunched, but her face. My God, her face. It was like looking into a mirror of my own features, just softened by time and experience. That I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I wanted to get out, to run across the street, to say Mom. But I froze, watching her water her plants like she was any ordinary neighbor, while I sat in my car realizing my entire life had been a carefully constructed lie. That night, back at my apartment, I couldn't shake the image. She was alive, real, just across the street from me, a stranger and my mother all at once. And for the first time, I felt something deeper than anger at my father. I felt a plan forming that if he'd hidden her from me, then maybe the best revenge wasn't to confront him immediately. Maybe the best revenge was to build something with her. To take back everything he'd stolen, not with yelling, not with fists, but with patience and precision. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just the son he controlled. I was my mother's son too. And together, I knew we could destroy the prison of lies he had built. I went back the next morning because sleeping on it only made the itch worse. Waiting felt like giving my father one more day of control, and I'd had enough of that to last a lifetime. I parked farther down the block this time and walked the rest of the way, rehearsing a dozen different openings in my head. None of them survived the front step. I rang the bell, then immediately wished I hadn't. A thin chime floated through the door, followed by footsteps and the soft scrape of a chain latch. When it opened, the woman from the garden stood there in a blue cardigan and worn jeans, a coffee mug cradled in both hands. Up close, the resemblance was sharper, same gray-green eyes, same stubborn line across the brow. A tiny white scar tugged at her upper lip, the kind you only notice if you're looking. I have the same one on my chin from a childhood fall. Can I help you? She asked carefully. Her voice carried a warmth that made my throat lock. I think you might be my mother. The words landed between us, fragile as glass. The mug trembled. She didn't move. For 3 full seconds, neither of us breathed. Then she whispered my name. Not Alex, the adult version I use at work. The nickname only family ever used. Lex. My knees nearly buckled. How would you? You wouldn't let go of the kitchen table leg, she said, the hint of a breathless laugh breaking through shock. You thought monsters lived under the tile. We had to pull you off like a barnacle. I didn't remember the table, but I remembered the panic. And the lullaby that followed. tiny boats, and drifting stars. When I said the first line, she finished the next without thinking. I didn't cry. I was past tears. But something heavy inside me loosened its grip. She unlatched the chain. "Come in, sweetheart." Her place was small but bright, sunlight falling across stacks of books and a framed print of a lighthouse. A cat lifted its head from an armchair, blinked once at me like it wanted to screen my intentions, and went back to sleep. She set the mug down on a coaster, then just stood there, wringing her hands like she didn't know where to put them. "I don't know what you were told," she said finally. "I've wanted to say this for so long, and now that you're here, I can't make my mouth work." "He said you died. In a car accident. When I was 3. Her face went still. No shock there. Only pain grinding against old knowledge. "Of course he did." We took the conversation to a booth at the corner diner because the air inside her house felt too tight for all the years we'd missed. I kept staring at the way she stirred her coffee. Absently, steady circles, like if I memorized enough small motions I could make up for lost time. She waited until the waitress left, then slid a worn envelope across the table. Inside were copies, a custody agreement, an old protective order, letters stamped, returned to sender, and a report she'd filed when we disappeared. "After I left your father. He promised I'd regret it," she said, not dramatic, just factual. "He had money I didn't have, lawyers I didn't have. He told the court I was unstable. He said I'd flee with you. By the time I proved I wasn't what he said, he'd already moved and sealed the records. When I sent letters, they came back. When I showed up at your daycare, the director told me my rights were suspended pending review. That review never came. How did he pull it off? He was organized and relentless. He knew which forms to file, knew who to call, and he wasn't afraid to scare me. I could have kept fighting. I did, until my savings was dust. The last time I tried to see you, a man I didn't know followed me back to my apartment. I decided I wasn't going to lead anyone to my door again." There was no melodrama in her voice, just the flat edge that comes from scraping your knuckles on the system too many times. I looked at the postmarks on the letters, years of them, marching forward like a calendar of absence. My name in the same looping hand I'd found in that attic envelope. "Why didn't you find me when I was older?" I asked, more bluntly than I intended. "When I could choose." "I tried," she said. "I kept checking databases, Facebook, school directories." He was careful. He went by initials. He changed numbers. He kept you off anything public. The first time I saw a photo of you again, you were in a company softball jersey at 28. I sat in my car and cried. The waitress topped off our coffees. Over her shoulder, the cook flicked pancakes with practiced wrists. For a second, everything around us looked so normal I wanted to yell. Instead, I took a breath and reached for something practical, something I could hold. "We should do a DNA test," I said. "Not because I don't believe you. I do. But if I'm going to dismantle the story he built, I want a foundation nobody can mess with." A small smile tugged at her mouth. "You always did like proof." We bought the kit at the drugstore down the block and did it in the front seat of my car, an oddly intimate ceremony for 2 people who'd been strangers that morning. She laughed when I read the directions out loud like a nervous student. When she handed back the sealed swab, her fingers brushed mine, and the cat's eye ring she wore clicked softly against the plastic. "Your grandmother's," she said. "I kept it in case you ever came home." I drove her back and she insisted I come inside. She wanted to show me something. From a shoebox in the bedroom closet, she lifted a small wooden music box, sanded maple, a hairline crack along the lid. "You used to wind it until the spring snapped," she said, and set it on the dresser. When she turned the key, the tune came out thin and wobbly, but recognizable, tiny boats and drifting stars. I wasn't 3 anymore, but the sound hit the exact spot where that age still lived that we didn't talk about revenge right away, though it sat between us like an extra guest. We talked about the middle years instead, birthdays we missed, injuries and promotions, holidays that landed like thuds. She told me about the bookkeeping service she'd built from her kitchen table, about clients who paid late, and one who sent thank you muffins every December. I told her about my job, about how success always tasted faintly of guilt and I hadn't known why. Only when the sky turned the color of cold steel did the conversation bend toward him. I told her about the way he controlled everything, how he'd smile for neighbors and harden inside the house. The nights he made future plans sound like orders. And that one line he always used, Don't dig into the past, she nodded, as if that was the piece she'd been expecting. He doesn't leave room for things he can't control, she said. And he can't control two people who love each other more than they fear him. I felt a shift then, a click like a lock rotating. I hadn't come for a confrontation. I'd come for a partner. We don't go to him, I said. We don't give him the chance to twist this. We build quietly. We gather documents. We confirm the DNA. We protect ourselves. And then, when he finally realizes the past he buried learned to breathe again, it'll be too late to smother it. She looked at me the way people look at the horizon right before a storm, the kind of steadiness that isn't absence of fear, just a decision to keep walking anyway. Whatever we do, she said, we do it clean. No lies. No threats. We do the opposite of what was done to us. Agreed. Before I left, she packed the shoebox with copies of everything. Court filings, returned envelopes, a list of names. People who remember, she said. A neighbor from our old building. The daycare aide. The woman at the legal aid clinic who helped me call the county twice a week. Some have moved. A couple still answer. In my car, I stared at the box on the passenger seat and realized how different the weight felt from the letter that started all this. The letter was a spark. This was a toolkit that I didn't call my father when I got home. I turned my phone off and ordered a second DNA kit to cross-validate the first. I scanned every page from the shoebox into an encrypted folder and titled it with something boring enough he'd never open it if he snooped. Q2_receipts. Then I opened a blank note and wrote the first line of the plan that would become the spine of my new life. Step 1. Build with mom. Step 2. Stay invisible. Step 3. Cut the hinges he thinks are the door. Somewhere in the apartment, pipes thumped and settled. The city's night sounds rose like a low tide. I wound the maple music box and set it on my desk. It played its thin little song, and the boats kept sailing, and the stars kept drifting, and for the first time since I was 3, I felt the floor of my past stop tilting under my feet. The DNA results hit my inbox on a Tuesday at 6:14 a.m., stamped with the kind of bureaucratic certainty you can't argue with. 99.99% parent-child match. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then forwarded the report to myself, my cloud, and a brand new encrypted drive labeled with the most boring name I could think of, quarterly_spreadsheets_final. Proof wasn't a theory anymore. It was a file that I didn't call my father. I made coffee, texted my mother, it's confirmed, and drove across town with the shoebox of documents buckled into the passenger seat like a person. She opened the door before I knocked, hair pulled back, eyes red in that relieved way grief turns into when it finally gets a direction to walk. We didn't hug for long. There was too much to do that we started with the list she'd given me. People who remember. First was Ms. Alvarez, the daycare aide from 30 years ago. She worked part-time at a community center now, hands still quick, voice still warm. When I said my name, something softened in her face like a curtain opening. I remember your mother, she said, leading us to a table where kids were coloring. She came with flowers for the office once, thought it would help. The director wouldn't even take them. I wrote that down. She meant it literally. Ms. Alvarez kept a battered spiral notebook from that year. Times, incidents, who picked up which child. She flipped to a page underlined 3 times in blue pen. Mother arrived, told not authorized, left crying. She let me scan the page with my phone, then signed a short statement she'd typed on a library computer. It wasn't a court win. It was a brick. Next was the woman from legal aid, Ms. Dorsey. Her hair had gone silver, but her voice had the same courtroom rasp that says I've outlasted worse. She pulled a banker's box from a back shelf with my mother's name written in faded marker. Your father knew the system, she said, tapping a stack of phone logs. He filed to suspend contact pending an evaluation he never intended to schedule. County backlog did the rest. Meanwhile, we called and called. She handed me copies, timestamps, notes, initials. The file's old, but it's clean. If anyone asks whether your mother stopped trying, the paper says otherwise. By late afternoon, we were at the old apartment building where my mother used to live. The super was new. The neighbor wasn't. Mr. Patel opened his door a crack, and then all the way when he recognized my mother. He remembered the day she moved out, the man in a suit waiting in the hall, the way she hugged a photograph like a life preserver. He also remembered something else, a P.O. box number my father used to give for official mail only. He said it in passing, like it didn't matter. My mother wrote it down like it mattered to everything. None of this was explosive. It was better. It was patient. It was the kind of truth that accumulates until denial looks ridiculous. We kept building quietly. At night, I scanned documents into that dull-sounding folder and mapped them on a timeline. Custody order filed. Address change. Letters returned. Daycare incident. Legal aid calls. My father's evaluation request that somehow never led to an appointment. Little pins on a map of lies. And then we started on the second part of our plan. Build with Mom. She was good with numbers. Not just tidy books good, pattern finding, anomaly smelling good. My father used to brag to neighbors about being an engineer who saw systems where other people saw clutter. Turns out I got that from both sides. We registered an LLC. She insisted we use my name first. I insisted we use hers, and split the difference. Lex and Lila Consulting. She'd been doing small business bookkeeping out of her kitchen. I'd been building data tools for compliance reviews at work. Together, we could offer something sharp, clean books and forensic cleanup for messy ones that we bought a cheap domain, threw up a simple site in an evening, and opened a business account. It felt mundane in the prettiest way. A life you can step into with both feet. The first client came through a friend of a friend. The second came from Ms. Dorsey, who recommended us to a nonprofit with grant reporting nightmares. We sat at my mother's table with color-coded spreadsheets and lukewarm tea, finding missing decimals and double payments like they were Easter eggs. I watched her face ease when a ledger reconciled. There's a kind of peace that only comes from making chaos behave that we were not targeting my father. We didn't have to. People orbiting his world began finding us on their own. A supplier he'd squeezed on net 30s that mysteriously stretched to 90. An HOA treasurer who'd hired him as a consultant to streamline reserve planning and ended up with opaque fees and an audit warning. No smear campaign. No anonymous emails. Just a new address people could go to when they were tired of confusion. One evening, halfway through a stack of invoices, my mother went very still. She slid an old photocopy across the table. It was a one-page form I hadn't noticed before. Consent to travel with minor, notarized, dated the year we disappeared. My mother's signature floated at the bottom, except it didn't. The loops were different. The R in her last name curled wrong. I looked over at the music box on the bookshelf and back at the page. Did you ever sign this? I asked. She shook her head. He'd bring me forms sometimes. I stopped signing anything unless I took it to the clinic to copy first. I never saw this one. There are moments that don't feel like fireworks, just like a new door appearing in a wall. I took a photo, then another with a ruler for scale, then checked the notary's name. It wasn't anyone we recognized. I wrote it down anyway. Another brick. When the day finally came that my father called, I let it ring out. He left a message. The voice that used to fill rooms sounded unexpectedly small on speaker. Son, we should talk. I heard you've been busy. No question, no apology. Just surveillance in sentence form. I texted my mother a screenshot of the voicemail transcript. She sent back a single line. We stay invisible. So we did. I changed my number for work, kept the old one fenced on a burner app. If he wanted to talk to me, he'd have to use his real voice. No triangulating through colleagues. No, happened to run into your boss. Instead, we kept our rhythm. We met the HOA treasurer, Janice, a retired math teacher with the smile of someone who'd taught herself not to back down. She handed us a box of receipts and rolled her eyes. If I hear the word retainer one more time, I'm going to crochet it on a pillow just so I can throw it. We traced the money. We didn't accuse. We asked questions in emails and copied the right people. For clarity, can you confirm whether the March and April consulting hours reflect project milestones? Our reconciliation shows duplicate billing under separate codes. Boring, polite, sharp. The kind of language that forces someone to walk back toward the truth in their own shoes. At night, when my brain hummed too loud to sleep, I'd open the P.O. box lead from Mr. Patel. A little digging, and a few public records later, it sprouted edges. The box had been opened by a shell company my father used during the custody mess. The registered agent? The same notary whose name sat under the forged-looking consent form. I didn't say the word forgery out loud. I wrote verify notary log on a sticky note and tucked it under my keyboard like a promise. Through all of it, I never let myself imagine a big, clean explosion at the end. No grand speeches at a family dinner. No lightning bolts. My father's favorite weapon had been control, quiet and daily. The antidote had to be the same. Still, some nights the rage came. Not like fire, more like pressure. I'd wind the maple music box, watch the worn gears catch, and let the thin tune occupy the space where names I didn't want to say out loud might have sat. I thought about little me gripping the table leg, making a bargain with fear. I thought about grown me writing timelines and emails and building a company with my mother's first name on the door that on a Thursday. Ms. Alvarez texted a photo she'd found stuck inside that old spiral, a Polaroid of me at 3, clutching a paper boat with marker stars. My mother and I looked at it together in her kitchen, not speaking. Some artifacts aren't evidence. They're fuel. Next step? She asked softly. 2 tracks, I said. We keep helping people who need clean books. And we pull the thread on the notary. Quietly. If there's a log, we get a copy. If there's a pattern, we map it. No headlines. No shouting. She nodded. And if he calls again? We let it ring, I said. He's going to feel the hinges start to loosen. That's enough for now. Outside, evening slipped down over the street. Inside, the printer spit out one more reconciliation summary, neat columns stacking like breath. We were done for the day, but the plan was not. Somewhere out there, a ledger we hadn't seen yet was waiting to be balanced. Somewhere out there, a notary journal had our missing line. And when we found it, we wouldn't need to raise our voices. The numbers would do it for us that I used to think silence meant safety. Growing up with my father, the less I said, the less trouble I made. But silence became a different kind of weapon once I realized he was trying to reach me. His calls stacked up, each voicemail a little shorter, a little sharper, a little more desperate. I didn't return a single one. Every unanswered ring was a crack in his certainty, and that crack was widening. Meanwhile, our work grew. Word spread about our tiny consulting service faster than we expected. We weren't flashy, but we were efficient, and we didn't play favorites. If something didn't add up, we fixed it, no matter who had signed the checks. That was what pulled in our third client connected to my father's orbit, a mid-sized contractor who had once partnered with him. The man, Kurt, sat across from me in a diner booth, his tie loosened, his eyes flicking around like he was afraid to be overheard. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were contracts, heavily marked up, with odd side agreements attached in sloppy handwriting. He told me these were standard, Kurt said. But we ended up paying 3 times the overhead, and when I pushed back, he threatened to blacklist me from every supplier he knew. My mother and I pored over the papers late into the night, highlighters in hand. What jumped out wasn't just the greed, it was the sloppiness. My father had always drilled precision into me, but here he was leaving trails, duplicate billing codes, overlapping dates, even a typo in his own company's registration number. It was almost insulting how easy it was to spot once we looked. This isn't just bad practice, my mother said. This is leverage. We didn't call him out. We didn't confront him. Instead, we built a clean packet of findings, no commentary, just facts. Kurt used it to negotiate an exit from the contract without a lawsuit. My father lost money. We gained another ally. And he still didn't know where the blow had come from. At the same time, I started digging into the notary lead we'd uncovered, the name attached to the suspicious consent form. The county clerk's office had digitized old notary journals, but you had to request access in person. I took a day off work, dressed like any other guy running errands, and sat in the records room flipping through dusty logs. There it was, the same notary. The same year, with half a dozen parental consent documents notarized for my father, each with different dates, all suspiciously close to the custody filings. I scanned the pages quietly, each image sliding into my encrypted folder like another nail in the coffin of his credibility. Driving home that night, I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. Not out of fear, out of something colder. Determination. My father had built his empire on forged papers and intimidation. I was going to dismantle it with the very tools he'd used, brick by brick, until the whole structure collapsed. But revenge isn't just about facts. It's about patience. And that was the part that tested me most. Some nights I wanted to storm his house, slam the papers on his desk, scream the truth into his face. But then I'd look at my mother, carefully folding invoices, humming under her breath while the music box played in the background, and I remembered why we were doing this quietly. We weren't here to explode. We were here to outlast. The turning point came when one of my father's own associates called us. A man named Dennis, who had worked under him for years, showed up at our office, a modest co-working space with peeling paint and a flickering light over the door. He looked worn out, his suit frayed at the cuffs, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "I heard you help people clean up their books," he said, almost whispering that we did. And when we started combing through his files, we found something chilling. Payments funneled through shell companies that traced back to the same P.O. box Mr. Patel had mentioned. My father had been running money in circles, keeping everyone confused while he pocketed the difference. Dennis leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "If this comes out, I'm finished. But if it doesn't, I think he'll ruin me anyway." I didn't promise him salvation. That wasn't my job. But I showed him the patterns, the duplicates, the paper trail that could protect him if he ever needed to turn whistleblower. He left our office with a folder under his arm and a look that was half dread, half relief. When he walked out, my mother turned to me. "He's cracking," she said. She didn't mean Dennis. She meant my father. His empire wasn't falling from one blow. It was leaking from every corner. And he didn't even know who was holding the bucket. That night, as I lay in bed, the music box still playing in my head, I realized something. The climax wasn't going to be some loud confrontation. It was going to be the silence that came when he finally looked around and realized the walls he built were gone. And for the first time, I found myself almost smiling at the thought to be why the time winter settled in. The silence between my father and me had turned into a battlefield of its own. He called less often now, but when he did, his voice was tight, clipped, like a man used to controlling every room who suddenly found the lights flickering. I didn't answer. Each unanswered ring was its own victory, but he wasn't a man who sat still for long. And soon enough, the pressure came from another direction. It was late January when my boss called me into his office. I'd been at the firm for nearly a decade, building a reputation as the guy who caught mistakes others missed. That morning, though, his tone was unusually sharp. "Alex," he said, closing the door behind me. "Your father came by yesterday." The air went cold around me. "He says he's worried about you. Something about you getting mixed up in, let's just say, questionable ventures." I sat back in the chair, keeping my face calm while inside my chest a war started. "And you believed him?" I asked. My boss looked at me steadily. "I told him you're one of my best analysts. But he has a way of planting seeds, doesn't he? Don't let this become a distraction." I don't want to have to answer more of his questions. It was classic him, using other people as mouthpieces, sliding poison into the well. He didn't have evidence, not yet, but he was circling, sniffing for weakness. That night, I told my mother. She didn't look surprised. "He used to show up at my jobs too," she said quietly. "Always polite, always smiling. But he left behind shadows." I clenched my fists. "He's trying to choke us before we grow roots. Then we dig deeper." She replied, "So we did that. We shifted part of our consulting work into a rented storage unit turned mini office. Cheap rent. No sign outside, just 2 desks and a scanner." From there, we combed through more records tied to his shell companies. Piece by piece, the map grew denser. Forged notary logs, phantom invoices, consulting fees that looped back to the same accounts. The deeper we dug, the more dangerous it felt. Not dangerous like guns or fists, dangerous like quicksand. My father's world was built to swallow people whole. But now, finally, we were charting the sinkholes. And then came the first direct crack in his mask. That it happened on a Thursday evening. My mother and I had just finished sorting a stack of receipts when headlights flashed across her living room window. I pulled the curtain aside and froze. A black SUV idled at the curb. He stepped out. My father. Even from the window, I could see the rigid set of his jaw, the way he scanned the street as if he owned it. He didn't look up at the house, didn't knock, just stood there for a full minute before getting back in the car and driving away. I turned to my mother, heart pounding. She was pale but steady. "He wants you to know he can still find us," she said. It was intimidation, pure and simple. No words, just presence. A reminder of the cage he'd once built around us. But what he didn't know was that the bars were already bending. The next day, I filed a quiet request with the state for certified copies of all notary records tied to his companies. It would take weeks, maybe months, but when those papers arrived, they'd carry weight no shadow visit could erase. Meanwhile, our client list grew. More and more people showed up, tired of his games. Some were careful, speaking in hushed tones. Others were furious, waving receipts like weapons. We listened, documented, built case files. And every file was another cut he couldn't see. But the closer we got, the more I felt the strain. Nights stretched into early mornings, coffee cups stacked by the sink, my mind buzzing with ledgers and timelines. Sometimes I'd hear phantom footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, a trick of nerves I couldn't shake. I'd wind the music box, let its broken tune steady me, and remind myself, we weren't just exposing him. We were reclaiming what he stole. The final straw that week came from an unexpected place. Dennis, the exhausted associate we'd helped, called me, his voice shaking. He knows something's off, Dennis whispered. He's asking questions. He told me if I hear anything about you, I should tell him immediately. He said he's watching. Watching. The word crawled under my skin that I thanked Dennis, told him to stay quiet, then hung up. My phone buzzed again almost instantly. An unknown number, voicemail left without a ring. I opened the transcript. Just one line, my father's voice, clipped and cold. Son, the past won't protect you. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. He was right, in a way. The past alone wouldn't save us. But it wasn't about saving anymore. It was about finishing that. I turned to my mother that night and said, it's time to tighten the net. He's circling. Let's make sure when he bites, he swallows the hook. She met my eyes. No fear, just fire. Then let's get to work. And we did. By February, the pressure had turned into a rhythm. Calls, silence, shadow plays. My father wasn't screaming, wasn't storming, wasn't demanding. He was circling. And circling predators only do that for so long before they strike that I felt it in my bones. Something was coming. The first blow landed at my workplace again. I was pulled into HR unexpectedly, a file already waiting on the desk. Inside were anonymous complaints, alleging that I was moonlighting in a way that conflicted with company values. The documents were vague, but one line cut through like glass: family conflicts impacting professional judgment. I didn't need to ask who planted it. That I laid out my defense calmly. I showed clean time sheets, company approvals for my consulting work on personal hours, and even a letter from one of our nonprofit clients thanking me for helping them recover misallocated funds. HR couldn't argue with facts. The file closed as quickly as it opened. But the damage wasn't the file, it was the reminder. He was testing my armor, looking for a crack. That night, I sat with my mother at the kitchen table, documents spread around us like cards in a game neither of us had asked to play. She poured tea, hands steady despite the storm swirling around us. He's trying to scare you into mistakes, she said. Then he'll have to wait a long time, I answered. But in truth, the stress was eating me alive. Sleep became a stranger, my mind replaying scenarios on a loop. I double-locked doors, checked the street twice before leaving, scanned faces in every cafe. The paranoia wasn't paranoia if it was earned. One evening, as I walked out of the office, a man I didn't recognize leaned against a lamppost across the street. He didn't move, didn't approach, just smoked a cigarette and watched. When I crossed to my car, he flicked the butt into the gutter and walked away. No words, no confrontation. Just another message. We see you. I drove straight to my mother's house, heart thundering. She listened, then opened a drawer I hadn't seen before. Inside was a folder, thicker than the shoebox we'd built our case from. What's that? I asked. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. The insurance I never used. Inside were copies of everything she'd kept hidden for years. Letters stamped "Return to Sender," affidavits from neighbors, even a police report from the night she was followed home. She'd gathered them, filed them, then locked them away, waiting for a day when someone could help her hold them up to the light. We're not just building a defense anymore, I said slowly. We're building a weapon. She nodded. The next week, I took a calculated risk. Through one of our clients, Janice, the HOA treasurer, we arranged to quietly meet a state auditor. Not for accusations, not yet. Just to ask questions. We presented hypothetical cases, forged notary logs, shell companies tied to personal accounts, consulting contracts with duplicate codes. The auditor listened, face neutral, pen scratching steadily across her notepad. When we finished, she looked up and said, if this were real, it wouldn't just be civil. It would be criminal. That single line echoed in my skull for days. That we didn't rush. We kept building. Every time my father tried to tighten the noose, we added another thread to ours. And then, for the first time, he slipped that it came in the form of a voicemail. He must have thought I'd answer, because the first few seconds weren't words, just the sound of him muttering to someone nearby. Then his voice, sharp, angry. They're not supposed to have anything left. If she kept records, I want to know where. Find out. He didn't hang up fast enough. The message saved automatically, crisp and clear, when I played it for my mother. Her eyes flashed with something I hadn't seen before. Not just hurt, not just anger, but vindication. He's afraid, she whispered, for decades. My father had been the storm, the one who set the terms of every battle. But fear changes the battlefield. Fear makes people sloppy. That night, I sat at my desk, the music box winding its broken tune beside me, and wrote the next step of our plan. Step 4. Push him to move. Document everything. Let his fear build our case. Because for the first time, I realized something crucial. We didn't need to corner him. We just needed to keep walking forward, steady and quiet, until he cornered himself, and he was already halfway there. The voicemail was more than a mistake. It was a shift in power. For years, my father had been the one pulling strings, whispering into phones, nudging the world in ways that left no fingerprints. Now, for the first time, he'd left his own voice behind. Uncontrolled, angry, afraid that I backed it up 6 different ways: encrypted drive, cloud, burner email, even a copy mailed to a P.O. box under my mother's name. If he wanted to erase me, he'd have to erase every corner of the map. But fear makes men reckless, and recklessness leaves trails. That it was a cold Friday night when I realized just how desperate he'd become. My car, parked outside my apartment, had a slip of paper tucked under the wiper blade. Just one line, scrawled in his familiar block letters: "Stop digging." I stood there under the street lamp, the words burning into me. He hadn't used intermediaries this time. No anonymous calls, no planted rumors. Just his handwriting, on my windshield, where anyone could see. It wasn't protection anymore. It was threat. That I didn't call the police. Not yet. Instead, I scanned it, cataloged it, and slid the original into the growing file we'd started calling the net. That weekend, my mother and I drove 3 towns over to meet Dennis again. He was jumpier than before, checking the diner windows every few minutes. He'd heard my father shouting at someone on the phone, furious about traitors. "He's losing people," Dennis said, stirring his coffee so hard it sloshed over the rim. "Guys who used to take his calls are dodging him. Suppliers are asking questions. He's trying to plug holes, but every time he does, 2 more open." I leaned forward. "And you? Where do you stand?" Dennis looked at me for a long time. Then he slid a flash drive across the table. "I can't do this out in the open. But I'm not going down with him. This has emails, transfers, contracts. You'll know what to do." When I opened the files later that night, my pulse spiked. It wasn't just shady accounting, it was outright fraud. Duplicate consulting fees billed to 2 clients for the same hours. Payments routed through shell companies back into his personal account. Even invoices for projects that never existed, stamped with forged signatures. It was the missing link we hadn't known we needed. His empire wasn't just rotten. It was criminal, but still, we didn't rush. We documented. We cross-referenced. We built timelines with cold precision. The goal wasn't to expose him yet. The goal was to make sure that when the dominoes fell, they didn't stop halfway. And then, just when I thought we had control, he struck closer to home. I came back to my apartment late one night and found the door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. Inside, nothing looked stolen, but drawers were pulled open, papers shuffled. Someone had searched, and they hadn't even bothered to hide it. On my desk, next to the music box, sat a single Polaroid. It was me, as a child, sitting on the kitchen floor, clutching the table leg just like my mother had described. Across the photo, in fresh marker, were 2 words: "Remember who raised you." I sank into the chair, the air buzzing in my ears. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was personal. He wanted me to know he still held the strings of memory, even if the strings of control were slipping. When I showed my mother, she went pale, but her jaw tightened. "He wants to scare you back into his story," she said. "But it's our story now." That night, I wrote another step on the plan taped under my desk. Step 5. Use his fear. Let him write his own confession, because that was the truth. The more desperate he became, the more careless he grew. The more careless he grew, the more evidence he left behind. And somewhere deep down, I knew the climax was coming. He wasn't going to sit quietly while his empire collapsed. He was going to lash out. And when he did, we'd be ready to turn his fury into the final proof we needed. The storm was almost here. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. The voicemail, the windshield note, the break-in, those weren't random. They were the tremors before the fault line split. We stopped waiting for the next crack and pushed, quietly, in the places that mattered. We built the packet we called the net. Not a rant, not a revenge manifesto. A surgical file, DNA confirmation, the custody timeline, the notary journal pages, the forged consent to travel with the wrong loop on the R, Ms. Alvarez's daycare entry, legal aid call logs, Dennis's exports, emails, transfers, duplicate consulting hours, the HOA retainer pattern Janice had flagged, the shell companies feeding the same P.O. box, and, stapled at the back, a transcript of my father's voicemail. If she kept records, I want to know where. Find out. We didn't blast it online. We sent 3 quiet packages to the state auditor, flagged for procurement and nonprofit abuse. To the Notary Commission, with a request to verify the log and seals. To a bank compliance office that handled 2 of his consulting accounts, accompanied by Dennis's ledger and wire paths. Then we went back to work. No victory laps, no chest beating, just invoices, reconciliations, tea cooling on the table, the music box ticking like a metronome. The first reply arrived in an unremarkable envelope on a Tuesday. The Notary Commission acknowledged irregularities, opened a formal review, and requested sworn statements. Irregularities is one of those words that sounds like a whisper until a door closes. We signed and overnight affidavits. My pen didn't shake. 2 days later, the bank called one of our clients, a supplier who'd complained about his net 30s turning into never, and asked a simple question: do you authorize duplicate payments for the same hours? By that afternoon, my father's merchant account showed temporary hold, internal review. I didn't need to log in to know. Dennis texted a screenshot with 3 words: he's raging. Man, we stayed invisible. Friday morning, the state auditor emailed Janice asking if she could clarify her homeowners association's retainer history with my father's company. She looped us in. The auditor's questions weren't dramatic. They were precise. Please provide invoices 14A, 14B, 14C, and evidence of milestones associated with each. Janice had already learned our rhythm. She attached the files and added, for completeness, note that code 311 appears on both 14A and 14B for identical dates. Translation: the duplicate billing we'd taught her to recognize. By noon, a second email hit. This one to a contractor who'd been squeezed on a side agreement we'd dissected over pie a month earlier. Field review scheduled. It said, a line that means, we're bringing clipboards and we're not leaving with guesses. My phone rang. Unknown number. I let it die in voicemail and opened the transcript. Father, we're going to fix this. Do you understand? Come to the office. Now that I didn't. Silence was still the planned. At 2:17 p.m., Janice texted, they're here. A photo followed. 3 people in navy jackets crossing her HOA's lobby, clipboards under arm, calm faces that have seen it all. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. The numbers were finally speaking in a language louder than his voice. That evening, my mother and I sat on her floor with the shoebox open between us. We didn't talk strategy. We watched the last light leave the window and listened to the music box's thin song. She rested her head on my shoulder. He made sure I didn't have a voice, she said. You gave the truth one. Saturday wasn't quiet. At 9:03 a.m., Dennis called from his car. He's calling everyone, he said, breathless. He's saying there's a smear campaign, that you're unstable, that your mother is. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Then Dennis added the line that mattered. He's putting it in writing. Asterisk. Emails started popping up in our forwarded mailbox, each angrier than the last. Destroy old logs. No cooperation without counsel. Everyone freezes communication until I say otherwise. He CC'd people he shouldn't have, names that had stayed in the shadows for years. In one message, he attached a reconstructed notary form, the signature laughably wrong, the seal impression a perfect match to the commission already under review. He had just handed the notary board a gift. At noon, my doorbell camera pinged. A courier signed for a thick envelope addressed to me in my father's handwriting. Inside, a cease and desist drafted by someone who hadn't read the room. It threatened defamation, demanded deletion of stolen documents, and closed with a sentence that landed like a confession. Any correspondence between you and individuals formerly retained by my company is a breach of proprietary confidentiality and must be surrendered immediately. The very formerly retained. We'd been waiting for his acknowledgement of those relationships that I scanned. I filed. I exhaled through my teeth until the sting left my chest. Late afternoon, the notary commission called my mother directly. The investigator's tone was careful but clear. Mrs. Hale, I'd like to confirm, on the dates in question, did you appear before Notary Stanton to sign consent to travel with minor? My mother answered with a steadiness she'd earned the hard way. No, I did not. The investigator paused, then said, thank you. We'll be issuing a notice of proposed action. Government for. The seal is compromised. He felt the water rising. Predators don't drown quietly. At 6:41 p.m., my boss texted. He showed up in our lobby. Security turned him away. You're fine here. The relief that rushed my body wasn't joy. It was a pressure valve finally hissing. And still, we didn't gloat. We ordered takeout, ate on cardboard boxes, and kept working. We mapped an event chain on a whiteboard. Notary review. Proposed action, revocation likely, bank hold. Suspicious activity report, probable. Auditor field reviews referrals, civil possible criminal. Cease and desist admissions chain of custody under it. I wrote. No contact. Let him move. Sunday morning, his mask cracked where I couldn't ignore it. He came to my mother's street. We saw him from the window first. Same black SUV, same stiff posture. He didn't get out right away. He stared at the house like it owed him an answer. When he finally stepped onto the curb, my hand found the back of the chair and held tight enough to hurt. I can call the police, I said, already reaching for my phone. My mother shook her head. You can call if he steps on the porch, she said calmly. Let him see the curtains are open. Let him see we're not hiding. He took 2 steps toward the walkway, then stopped. We watched him make the choice he always made. Push, but not enough to be caught. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket, hesitated, and then, like he'd remembered the bank holds, the notary notice, the auditors, he shoved it back into his coat and returned to the SUV. The engine roared. He drove away. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until the glass fogged where I stood. My mother touched my shoulder. He knows, she said quietly. He finally knows he can't talk this away. That afternoon, Dennis sent one more file. Subject line, for when the time comes. Inside was a calendar invite from 6 months ago, my father scheduling strategic billing alignment with 2 clients and his own shell entity. The time blocks overlapped. The call-in details were identical. Next to it, a note from my father, repeat last cycle. Same codes. The kind of line an auditor circles without looking up. I stared at the screen until the letters doubled. Not with fear. With finality. By evening, my phone buzzed with a number I knew by heart, but hadn't answered in months. I almost let it go. Then I looked at my mother, at the shoebox, at the whiteboard, at the music box with its hairline crack, and I pressed accept. I didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. Meet me, he said. A command softened by something I'd never heard in his voice before. Now. Public place, I said. Neutral ground. 30 minutes. He named the old diner off the highway, the one where he used to take me on Saturdays and explain the world like it was a machine only he could fix. I said, I'll bring someone. He laughed once, sharp and joyless. Of course you will. I hung up and turned to my mother. Are you sure? I asked. The plan had never included a face-to-face. Plans change when the door you were pushing finally opens. She lifted her coat from the chair. He's not the door, she said. He's just the last hinge. We drove in silence. The sky had that flat winter gray that makes headlights look farther away than they are. In the back seat, the binder with the net buckled in like a passenger. My hand drifted to it at every red light. Not for comfort, for calibration. When the diner's neon sign appeared, humming the same tired welcome it had hummed my whole childhood, I felt the old fear try to climb my spine. I let it. I watched it. And then I left it in the car. Inside, the booths looked smaller, the pies older, the coffee just as bad. He sat at a corner table, the same posture, the same suit, but less of him inside it. He looked up at us, at me, then at my mother, and something passed over his face I couldn't translate. History, maybe, or the realization that history had finally stopped obeying him. Sit. He said that we did. He opened with accusations. I opened the binder. He threw family. My mother laid down the notary notice. He said defamation. I slid across his own email, destroy old logs. He went for pity. Janice's retainer timeline stared back. He reached for control. The bank hold notice waited calmly in the next sleeve. Every time he reached for the old levers, his hand closed on paper. The waitress refilled our coffees twice. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. When he ran out of words, he pressed his fingers to his temples like the room was too bright. What do you want? He asked finally, the 4 words he'd used to negotiate the world for decades. He expected tribute. He expected a price. That I glanced at my mother. She nodded once. We're not here to bargain, I said. We're here to be done. He blinked. Done. You will not contact my employer again. You will not contact my mother. You will not send people to our homes. If you do, you will learn how thorough this binder is. He stared at the spine of the net like it might bite. You think you've won. I thought of a little boy gripping a table leg, of a woman with a music box and a stack of returned letters, of suppliers and treasurers and tired associates who'd finally had enough. I think the numbers finally told the truth, I said. He laughed then. A short, startled sound that didn't know whether it was anger or grief. He looked at my mother as if seeing her for the first time. You taught him to keep records, he said. No, she replied. You did. I just stopped letting you own them. The wind rattled the diner's door. Somewhere behind the counter, a timer dinged. Life went on, indifferent to storms ending. He pushed back from the table. For a heartbeat, I thought he might reach across, try one last time to close his hand around my life. He didn't. He stood, mouth a thin line, eyes gone flat. This isn't over, he said, defaulting to the only promise he knew how to make. It is for us. I answered. He left without looking back. The bell above the door giving a single tired ring that we didn't move for a long time. When we finally stood, the waitress slid the check toward us with a look that said she'd seen families do 1,000 kinds of endings in that booth. Good luck, she murmured. Outside, the cold hit like a clean slate. In the car, my mother rested her hand on the binder and exhaled. Not relief exactly. Something steadier. Tomorrow, I said, we send the final packet. She nodded. And then we stop fighting and start living. The music box sat on the back seat, the crack in its lid catching the neon glow. I turned the key once, gently, and let the thin melody carry us home. The storm had broken. Now came the quiet where new things grow. The night of reckoning didn't come with fireworks. It came quietly, like a storm that had been brewing too long and finally broke. My father thought he was in control until the very end. He thought intimidation, old tricks, and fear would silence me. But by then, every piece of his empire had already been turned against him. The evidence Dennis gave me, the documents we compiled, the recordings, the threats he left in his own voice, they weren't just proof. They were weapons. And this time, I didn't need to swing them in anger. I just had to let them fall into the right hands. The final push came on a gray Tuesday morning. My mother and I walked into a federal office with a box full of everything we had gathered. Financial records, fraudulent contracts, emails, even the Polaroid he left in my apartment, now logged as intimidation. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice, wrapped in neat little files and witness statements. When the agents opened that box, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: release. Like finally putting down a weight I didn't even know I had been carrying since childhood. IT didn't take long after that. His allies scattered as soon as they sensed the walls closing in. His accounts froze. His name hit the news, not as a powerful man, but as a criminal facing charges. And for once, he couldn't silence it. Every headline was another nail in the coffin of the empire he'd built on lies. But the part that shocked me most wasn't his downfall. It was what came after. The silence. The first night I came home and didn't check the locks twice. The first morning I woke up and didn't feel the knot in my chest. The first time I sat across from my mom at breakfast and saw her laugh, really laugh, like she hadn't in years. He had stolen decades from us. But what he couldn't take, no matter how hard he tried, was the life we still had left to build. Today, I'm not the broken kid clutching a table leg in fear. I'm not the son who lived in a false reality for 30 years. I'm a man who took back his story. I've built a life filled with people who chose me, not out of obligation, but out of love. And I've learned something powerful. Revenge isn't just about destruction. Sometimes it's about survival, about reclaiming the pieces of yourself someone else tried to erase. Oh yeah, he lost everything. And me? I gained my freedom. And now I'll ask you, just like I promised, did I do the right thing? What would you have done in my place? If you want to hear more stories like mine, raw, dramatic, and real, make sure you subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. I read every one, and I want to know, what would your revenge look like? Bye-bye.